The sound of gunfire shattered the peaceful afternoon air as Margaret Collins ran toward her modest home on the edge of Black Hawk, Colorado. Her heart hammered against her ribs when she saw the door swinging open, splintered near the lock. The year was 1876, and the mining boomtown had seen its share of violence, but never had it touched her life so directly. "Samuel!" She screamed her son's name as she burst through the doorway. The interior of the small cabin was in disarray, furniture overturned, her few precious possessions scattered across the floor. But it was the silence that terrified her most. Her 6-year-old son always came running at the sound of her voice. "Samuel, where are you?" Only emptiness answered her desperate calls. Margaret fell to her knees beside Samuel's small bed, clutching his wooden toy horse to her chest. The tracks of multiple boots in the dirt outside told the story men had come while she was delivering laundry to the hotel in town. Men had taken her boy. As darkness fell, Margaret moved like a ghost through Black Hawk's muddy streets toward the sheriff's office. At 24, she had already endured more hardship than most women twice her age. Widowed 2 years prior when her husband died in the mine collapse, she had managed to keep herself and Samuel alive through backbreaking work as a laundress. Now, with her son missing, the strength that had sustained her was crumbling. Sheriff Mills barely looked up from his desk when she entered. "Mrs. Collins, I heard about the trouble at your place." "Then why aren't you out searching for my son?" Margaret's voice trembled with fear and fury. The sheriff sighed, setting down his pen. "I've sent word to the nearby towns. But if it's the Harper gang like folks are saying, they're already halfway to the mountains." The Harper gang. Margaret's blood ran cold. Everyone knew of Elias Harper and his band of cutthroats who terrorized the Colorado Territory. 3 men matching their description were seen riding out of town with a child. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Collins, but my deputy's down with fever and I can't chase after them alone." Margaret slammed her palm on the desk. "So you'll do nothing while those monsters have my boy?" The sheriff looked away. "I'll send telegrams. That's all I can promise." As Margaret turned to leave, the door opened. A tall man stepped into the office, his frame silhouetted against the fading daylight. Dust covered his dark clothes, and the spurs on his boots jingled softly as he moved forward. When he removed his hat, she saw a face weathered by sun and wind, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Trouble, Sheriff." His voice was deep and quiet. "Nothing that concerns you, Blackett," the sheriff replied tersely. The stranger's eyes shifted to Margaret, noting her tear-streaked face. "Madam." Something in his direct gaze made Margaret speak. "They've taken my son, Bandits, the Harper gang." The man named Blackett stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Harper," he repeated, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. Sheriff Mills stood up. "Now, don't go getting ideas, Blackett. This isn't your fight." The tall man ignored him, his focus entirely on Margaret. "How old is your boy?" "6, Margaret whispered. "His name is Samuel." Blackett nodded once, then turned to leave. "Wait." Margaret followed him outside into the darkening street. "Please, can you help me? The sheriff won't do anything." He studied her for a long moment. "Name's Benjamin Blackett. Most folks call me Ben." He glanced toward the mountains rising in the distance. "I know Harper's usual trails, been tracking him for some time." Hope flared in Margaret's chest. "You're a bounty hunter." "Sometimes." His expression revealed nothing. "Other times I'm just a man settling scores." "I have some money saved," Ben cut her off with a shake of his head. "Keep your money, you'll need it." "Then why would you help me?" Margaret asked, suspicious of his motives. His eyes darkened. "I have my reasons to find Harper. Your boy is just one more." Margaret stepped closer. "Mr. Blackett, I need to know, can you bring my son back?" Ben settled his hat back on his head, his face half hidden in shadow. "Mrs. Collins, I'll bring him back or die trying. That's the only promise worth making." As he turned to leave, Margaret called after him, "I'm coming with you." Ben stopped, looked back at her with disbelief. "No, you're not. He's my son." Margaret's voice held steel. "I won't sit here waiting while he's terrified, wondering if I've abandoned him. It's no place for a woman. We'll be riding hard, sleeping rough. Harper's men will kill anyone who comes after them." Margaret's chin lifted. "I buried my husband 2 years ago. I've kept my son and myself alive since then. I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Blackett." For the first time, a hint of something perhaps respect flickered in Ben's eyes. "We leave at first light. Bring only what you can carry on a horse." The eastern sky was barely tinged with pink when Margaret arrived at the livery stable the next morning. She wore her husband's old trousers beneath her skirt, a decision that had caused her internal debate, but seemed the only practical choice for hard riding. A small pack containing essentials hung from her shoulder. Ben was already there, saddling 2 horses. He glanced at her bundle. "That all you're bringing?" "Everything important is coming with me on this horse," she replied, moving toward the chestnut mare he'd prepared for her. "Rifle?" he asked. Margaret hesitated. "I have James's revolver." Ben nodded. "You know how to use it?" "I can hit what I aim at," she answered truthfully. Living alone on the edge of town had required certain precautions. As they rode out of Black Hawk, the town was just beginning to stir. Margaret felt the curious stares of early risers, but kept her gaze straight ahead. Every minute that passed was another minute Samuel spent in the hands of men who had no reason to treat him kindly. "How far ahead are they?" she asked as they reached the foothills. "Half a day, maybe more," Ben replied. "They'll be headed for Harper's hideout in the mountains. There's an old mining camp they use." His voice hardened. "We'll need to catch them before they reach it." "How do you know so much about Harper?" Ben's face closed. "That's my business." They rode in silence as the morning sun climbed higher. Margaret had never ventured this far into the wilderness, and despite her worry for Samuel, she couldn't help noticing the beauty of the rugged landscape, towering pines, rocky outcroppings, and valleys carpeted with wildflowers. Around midday, Ben held up his hand for a halt. He dismounted and crouched near the ground, examining something Margaret couldn't see. "3 horses," he said. "One carrying double. They stopped here." He pointed to a flattened area of grass, "probably to rest the horses and eat." Margaret slid down from her mare, wincing at the unfamiliar ache in her muscles. "How recently?" 3-4 hours. Ben straightened. "They're pushing hard to reach the mountains by nightfall." As they continued their pursuit, the terrain grew more challenging. The trail narrowed, winding up steep inclines where loose stones made footing treacherous for the horses. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered over the distant peaks. "Storm coming," Ben observed. "Might work in our favor. Rain will slow them down." "Or wash away their trail," Margaret countered. Ben gave her an appraising look. "You're right about that. We need to find shelter before it hits. There's an old trapper's cabin not far from here. We can wait it out there." The cabin was little more than a single room with a sagging roof, but it offered protection from the elements. By the time they reached it, fat raindrops were already pelting down, quickly becoming a deluge. Ben tended to the horses while Margaret cleared debris from the stone fireplace. With shaking hands, she managed to start a small fire with the dry kindling Ben had carried in his saddlebag. They ate a meager supper of jerky and hardtack, the storm raging outside. Margaret stared into the flames, seeing Samuel's face. Was he warm? Had they fed him? Was he crying for her? "You should rest," Ben said, breaking into her thoughts. "Tomorrow will be harder. I can't sleep." Margaret wrapped her arms around herself. Every time I close my eyes, I see him scared and alone. Ben was silent for a moment, then said, "Harper doesn't hurt children, not without reason." "You say that like it should comfort me. It's not comfort, it's truth." Ben's face was half illuminated by the fire's glow. "Harper's many things, but he has rules. One is that children aren't to be harmed unless they're in the way of something he wants. And what does he want with my son?" Ben hesitated. "Ransom, most likely, or leverage." "I have no money for ransom," Margaret said bitterly, "and no influence with anyone. Then there's something else." Ben studied her. "Why would Harper's men target your home specifically?" Margaret shook her head. "I don't know. We have nothing of value. Your husband, what did he do before he died?" James worked in the mine like most men in Black Hawk. "Nothing else," Margaret frowned. "He kept to himself mostly. Sometimes he'd disappear for days, saying he was prospecting." A memory surfaced. "Once he came back with a small leather pouch. He wouldn't show me what was inside, just said it would change our lives someday." Ben leaned forward. "Where is this pouch now?" "I don't know. After the mine collapse, I never found it among his things." Thunder crashed overhead, making Margaret jump. Ben stood and moved to check the cabin's single window. "Get some sleep," he said again. "I'll take first watch." Despite her protest that she couldn't sleep, exhaustion eventually overcame Margaret. She awoke hours later to find the storm had passed and Ben sitting by the dying fire, his revolver across his knees. "Your turn to rest," she told him. He looked as if he might refuse, then nodded and stretched out on his bedroll. Within minutes, his breathing had deepened into sleep. Margaret watched him in the faint light of the embers. In repose, his face looked younger, the hard lines softened. What drove this man to risk his life for a stranger's child? His hatred for Harper seemed personal, beyond the dislike any law-abiding citizen would feel for an outlaw. As dawn broke, they were again on the trail. The rain had indeed slowed their quarry. Fresh tracks were visible in the mud. "They're moving toward Broken Ridge," Ben said, pointing to a jagged formation in the distance. "There's a pass there that leads to Harper's territory." They pushed the horses harder, following a stream that wound through a narrow valley. Around midday, Ben suddenly reined in, raising his hand for silence. Margaret strained her ears and heard it, the distant sound of voices. Ben dismounted and tied his horse to a tree. "Stay here with the horses," he whispered. "No," Margaret hissed back. "I'm coming with you." After a moment's hesitation, he nodded, and they continued on foot, moving stealthily through the underbrush. Soon they reached a clearing where 3 men had made camp beside the stream. A small figure sat huddled near the fire, arms wrapped around drawn-up knees. "Samuel." Margaret's heart leaped at the sight of her son, alive and seemingly unharmed. She started forward instinctively, but Ben's hand clamped on her arm. "Wait," he breathed against her ear. "We need a plan. There are 3 of them, all armed." One of the men, a burly figure with a bushy beard, stood up and stretched. "Harper's gonna want to know what's taking so long," he said to the others. "We should have been at the hideout by now." "Blame the damn rain," another replied, a thin man cleaning a rifle. Trail was too slick to risk in the dark. The third man, younger than the others, was keeping watch over Samuel. "What's Harper want with this kid anyway? He ain't said a word since we grabbed him." Bushy beard spat into the fire. "Not our business to ask. We just deliver the boy and collect our pay." Margaret turned to Ben. "We have to do something," she whispered. "Now, while they're distracted." "I'll create a diversion," Ben murmured. "When they're looking away, get to your boy and run for the horses. Don't wait for me." Before she could protest, Ben had slipped away through the trees. Margaret waited, heart pounding, eyes fixed on Samuel's small form. Her fingers found the revolver tucked into her waistband. Suddenly, A gunshot rang out from the far side of the clearing. The three men sprang to their feet, weapons drawn. "What the hell was that?" the younger one shouted. "Check it out," Bushy Beard ordered. "You stay with the kid," he told the thin man with the rifle. As the younger outlaw moved toward the trees, another shot sounded, closer this time. The thin man raised his rifle, scanning the tree line. It was the opportunity Margaret needed. She darted forward, staying low to the ground. Samuel's head jerked up at her approach, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Mama," he whispered. "Essich baby." Margaret pressed a finger to her lips. She reached for him just as the thin man turned. "Hey!" he shouted, raising his rifle. A third shot cracked through the air, and the man cried out, dropping his weapon as red blossomed on his shoulder. Margaret grabbed Samuel and ran for the trees. Her son clutched tightly against her chest. Shouts and more gunfire erupted behind them. Margaret didn't look back, focusing only on reaching the horses. Samuel was sobbing against her neck, his small arms locked around her. She found the horses where they'd left them, still tethered to the trees. Lifting Samuel onto her mare, she was about to mount behind him when Ben burst through the underbrush, blood streaming from a gash on his temple. "Go," he yelled, untying his horse. "They're right behind me." Margaret swung up behind Samuel, gathering the reins in trembling hands. Ben mounted in one fluid motion, then leaned over to slap her mare's flank. "Ride east toward the ridge," he shouted as they galloped away from the clearing. They rode hard, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter behind them. Samuel clung to Margaret, his face buried against her. She could feel his heart racing, matching the frantic rhythm of her own. The terrain grew increasingly rocky as they approached the ridge. Ben led them into a maze of stone formations where the horses had to pick their way carefully. Finally, he signaled a halt in a small protected gully where a spring trickled down the rock face. "We should be safe for a moment," he said, dismounting. He winced as he touched the wound on his temple. Margaret helped Samuel down, then knelt to embrace him properly. "Are you hurt?" "Did they hurt you?" Samuel shook his head, his eyes huge in his pale face. "I was scared, Mama. I thought you weren't coming." "I will always come for you," Margaret whispered fiercely, pressing kisses to his dirt-streaked cheeks. She looked up at Ben. "Thank you." Ben nodded, dipping a bandana in the spring to clean his wound. "We're not safe yet. Harper's main camp is still ahead of us, and those men will have sent word that we've taken the boy. So we can't go forward and we can't go back the way we came," Margaret said. "What do we do?" Ben studied the terrain. "There's another way down from the ridge, rougher, less traveled. If we can reach it before nightfall, we might slip past Harper's lookouts." Margaret helped Samuel drink from the spring. Her son seemed unnaturally quiet, watching Ben with wary eyes. "Samuel," she said gently, "this is Mr. Blackett. He helped me find you." Samuel looked at the tall man dubiously. "Are you a lawman?" A ghost of a smile touched Ben's lips. "No, son, just someone who doesn't like men who take children from their mothers." They rested only briefly before continuing their journey. Ben led them through a labyrinth of narrow passages between towering rocks, always alert for signs of pursuit. Margaret kept Samuel in front of her on the mare, one arm wrapped securely around him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape, they reached a point where the ridge dropped away sharply. Below them stretched a valley dotted with pines and bisected by a silver ribbon of river. "There," Ben pointed to a barely visible trail zigzagging down the steep slope. "That's our way down." "It looks dangerous," Margaret observed, eyeing the precarious path. "It is, but the alternative is worse." Ben dismounted. "We'll have to lead the horses. It's too steep for riding." The descent was harrowing. Loose stones skittered beneath their feet, threatening to start small avalanches. The horses balked repeatedly, requiring coaxing to continue. Samuel trudged beside Margaret, stumbling with fatigue. Darkness had fully descended by the time they reached the valley floor. Ben found a sheltered spot beneath an overhang where they could make camp without a fire. Samuel fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the ordeal. Margaret covered him with her shawl, then sat beside him, watching his peaceful face in the moonlight. Ben kept his voice low. "You should try to sleep too." "What did they want with him?" Margaret asked instead. "I need to understand." Ben was silent for a long moment. "I think it has to do with whatever was in that pouch your husband had. But what could it possibly be, and how would Harper know about it?" "Harper has connections in every town from here to Denver. If your husband found something valuable like gold," Margaret interrupted, "we would have used it. We were barely surviving after James died." "Not gold," Ben said thoughtfully. "Something else. Something worth more than money to Harper." Margaret stroked Samuel's hair. "He hasn't said much about what happened. Give him time. Children are resilient, but he's been through a lot." "And you?" Margaret studied his profile in the darkness. "What drives you to risk your life chasing Harper?" Ben's jaw tightened. "That's a long story. We have all night," Margaret said softly. After a long pause, Ben spoke. "5 years ago I had a wife, Sarah. We had a small ranch near Boulder." His voice was controlled, but Margaret heard the undercurrent of pain. "Harper and his men came through the area. They wanted our land, said there was silver beneath it. When I refused to sell, they burned us out." Margaret's hand went to her throat. "Your wife. She was inside when they set the fire." Ben's voice was flat now, drained of emotion. "I was in town getting supplies. By the time I got back, it was too late." "I'm so sorry," Margaret whispered. "I've been tracking Harper ever since. Got close a few times, but he always slips away." Ben looked over at Samuel's sleeping form. "When I heard they'd taken your boy, I knew this might be my chance to finally end it." Margaret absorbed his words, understanding now the cold fury that sometimes flashed in his eyes. "Revenge won't bring her back." "No," Ben agreed, "but justice might let her rest easier." The night passed slowly. Margaret eventually dozed, waking frequently to check on Samuel. Each time she found Ben still awake, keeping vigilant watch. At first light they continued their journey, following the river that wound through the valley. Samuel seemed more animated, pointing out wildlife and asking Ben questions about tracking. "How do you know which way the bad men went?" he asked, riding double with Ben while Margaret followed on her mare. "By reading signs," Ben explained patiently. "Broken twigs, disturbed earth, even the way birds fly can tell you if someone's passed by recently." Samuel considered this. "Could you teach me?" "If your mother doesn't mind," Ben replied, glancing back at Margaret. She smiled, grateful for the way Ben treated Samuel not as a burden, but as a small person worthy of respect. It had been a long time since any man had shown interest in her son's development. By midday, they had covered significant ground. The terrain was becoming less mountainous, transitioning to rolling foothills covered with scrub and occasional stands of aspen. "We should reach Silverton by nightfall," Ben said during a brief rest. "There's a sheriff there I trust. He can arrange safe passage back to Black Hawk for you and Samuel." "And you?" Margaret asked, though she already suspected the answer. Ben's eyes turned toward the mountains they'd left behind. "Harper's still out there. So you'll go back alone against all of them." Margaret couldn't keep the dismay from her voice. Before Ben could respond, Samuel spoke up. "I remember something the bad men said, Mr. Blackett. They talked about a map." Ben crouched down to the boy's level. "A map? Do you remember what kind of map?" Samuel's brow furrowed in concentration. "They said my pa had a map that showed where something important was hidden. They kept asking me where pa put it before he died." Margaret and Ben exchanged a look of realization. "The pouch," Margaret said. "What did you tell them, Samuel?" Ben asked gently. "Nothing. I didn't know what they were talking about." Samuel's lower lip trembled. "They got mad when I couldn't tell them." Margaret pulled her son close. "You did exactly right, sweetheart." Ben stood, his expression troubled. "If Harper's after a map, this isn't over. He'll come after you again, thinking you know where it is." Fear gripped Margaret's heart. "What can we do?" "First, we get to Silverton and send word to Sheriff Mills in Black Hawk. Then we figure out what was in that pouch and why Harper wants it so badly." They resumed their journey with renewed urgency. The relative ease of the terrain allowed them to make good time, and by late afternoon, they caught sight of smoke rising from chimneys in the distant Silverton. As they approached the outskirts of town, however, Ben suddenly reined in his horse, holding up his hand in warning. Margaret stopped beside him, alarmed by his tense posture. "What is it?" she whispered. Ben nodded toward the road ahead. "Riders coming this way, 4 of them." Margaret's heart sank as she saw the dust cloud raised by approaching horsemen. Harper's men, probably. Ben assessed their position. They were exposed on the open road with little cover nearby. "We need to get off this road now." They veered toward a copse of trees to their right, but it was too late. Shouts rang out as the riders spotted them and spurred their horses forward. Ben made a split-second decision. "Take Samuel and ride for town. Don't stop for anything." "What about you?" Margaret protested. "I'll hold them off." Ben reached for his rifle. "Go." Margaret hesitated only a moment before pulling Samuel onto her horse and galloping toward Silverton. Behind them, she heard Ben's rifle crack twice in rapid succession. She didn't look back, focusing only on the town growing larger ahead of them. Samuel clung to her, his small body trembling. "It's all right," she murmured, though her own heart was racing with fear. "We're almost there." They thundered into Silverton's main street, startling pedestrians who scrambled out of their way. Margaret reined in before the sheriff's office, practically falling from the saddle in her haste. "Help!" she cried as she burst through the door, Samuel's hand clutched in hers. "Please, we need help," the sheriff, a broad-shouldered man with a gray-streaked beard, rose from his desk. "What's the trouble, madam?" "Men chasing us outlaws, Harper's gang," Margaret gasped. "My friend is holding them off on the road, but he needs help." The sheriff's expression hardened at Harper's name. He grabbed his shotgun and called to 2 deputies lounging nearby. "Johnson, Peter's with me. Reynolds, stay here with the lady and her boy." As the lawmen rushed out, Margaret sank onto a bench, pulling Samuel into her lap. The remaining deputy offered them water, which she accepted gratefully. "Where are you folks from?" the deputy asked. "Black Hawk," Margaret replied. "My son was kidnapped by Harper's men. Mr. Blackett helped me rescue him." The deputy's eyebrows rose. "Blackett, Ben Blackett." Margaret nodded. "Well, I'll be," the deputy muttered. "Thought he'd given up the hunt after what happened in Denver last year." Before Margaret could ask what he meant, gunfire sounded from the edge of town. She clutched Samuel tighter, praying that Ben was safe. The wait seemed interminable. Samuel dozed against her shoulder, emotionally spent. Margaret stroked his hair, her eyes fixed on the door, willing it to open with good news. Finally, after what felt like hours, the door swung open. The sheriff entered first, followed by his deputies and Ben. Margaret's relief was so profound she felt dizzy with it. "Your friend's quite a shot, madam," the sheriff said with grudging respect. "Took down 2 of Harper's men before we even got there. The other 2 surrendered quick enough when they saw our badges." Ben's eyes found hers across the room. There was a fresh cut on his cheek, but he was otherwise unharmed. "You both all right?" Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Samuel stirred at the sound of Ben's voice, blinking sleepily. "Mr. Blackett," he mumbled. Did you catch the bad men?" A rare smile crossed Ben's face. "Some of them. The rest won't bother you again." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Mrs. Collins," Margaret supplied. "Margaret Collins, Mrs. Collins. I've sent a telegram to Sheriff Mills in Black Hawk informing him of your situation. We'll arrange an escort to take you home as soon as possible." Margaret thanked him, then turned back to Ben, who was speaking quietly with one of the deputies. When he approached, his expression was grim. "What is it?" she asked. "Harper wasn't among the men we captured," Ben said. "And there's more. One of them talks said Harper's been searching for a map that leads to a cache of stolen army gold from back during the war, gold that was never recovered." Understanding dawned on Margaret. "And he thinks James had this map." Ben nodded. "Your husband must have found it while prospecting. That's what was in the pouch." "But I never saw any map after he died," Margaret insisted. "I went through all his things." "Maybe he hid it," Ben suggested. "Somewhere in your home, perhaps." Samuel tugged at Margaret's skirt. "Mama, is Pa's map important?" Margaret looked down at her son. "Do you know something about a map, Samuel?" The boy nodded slowly. "Pa showed me once. He said it was our secret. He put it inside his special Bible, the one with Grandpa's name in it." Margaret gasped. "The family Bible, of course." "I never thought to look there. It stays on the shelf by his bed." "Harper will have men watching your place," Ben said. "We'll need to be careful." The sheriff arranged for them to stay at the hotel that night. After a proper meal, the first in days, and a warm bath for Samuel, Margaret tucked her son into bed in their small room. "Mama," Samuel whispered as she smoothed his hair. "Is Mr. Blackett going to stay with us?" Margaret paused. "I don't know, sweetheart. He has his own path to follow." "I like him," Samuel said, yawning. "He's brave like Pa was." Margaret kissed his forehead. "Yes, he is. Now sleep." She found Ben in the hotel's small dining room nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up as she approached, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Samuel's asleep," she said, sitting down. "He's exhausted, poor thing." "He's a strong boy," Ben remarked. "Takes after his mother." Margaret smiled slightly at the compliment. "What happens now?" Ben turned his cup slowly between his hands. "The sheriff's arranged for 3 deputies to escort you back to Black Hawk tomorrow. They'll help you retrieve the map safely." "And you?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer from his use of you instead of we. "I'm going after Harper." Ben's voice was quiet but determined. "This ends now." Margaret reached across the table, laying her hand over his. "It doesn't have to be your burden alone anymore, Ben." He stared at their hands for a long moment. "What else would I do? This has been my life for 5 years." "Live," Margaret said simply. "Start again. Help people who need it." A shadow of something longing perhaps crossed Ben's face before he withdrew his hand. "It's too late for that." Margaret wanted to argue, to tell him it was never too late, but she recognized the wall he had built around himself. A wall constructed of grief and vengeance that would not easily be breached. "Thank you," she said instead. "For everything you've done for Samuel and me. I don't know how I can ever repay you." "There's no debt," Ben replied. "Just be safe, and keep that boy of yours close." Morning came too soon. The deputies were ready at dawn, horses saddled for the journey to Black Hawk. Margaret and Samuel prepared to leave, their few belongings packed. Ben stood in the hotel doorway as they emerged, his own horse ready nearby. There was something different about him, a quietness that went beyond his usual reserve. "You're coming with us?" Margaret asked, hope rising despite herself. "To a point," Ben said. "I'll ride with you until we're close to Black Hawk, then I'll break off to track Harper." Samuel stepped forward, offering Ben his small hand with grave formality. "Thank you for saving me, Mr. Blackett." Ben crouched down, accepting the handshake. "You're welcome, Samuel. You take care of your mother now." "I will," the boy promised solemnly. The journey back to Black Hawk was uneventful, for which Margaret was grateful. The deputies were competent men who kept a watchful eye on the trail, and Samuel's spirits improved with each mile that brought them closer to home. Ben rode slightly apart from the group, often scanning the horizon or disappearing briefly to check side trails. He spoke little, but Margaret often caught him watching her and Samuel with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. On the afternoon of the second day, they reached the fork where the trail to Black Hawk branched from the main road. Ben reined in his horse. "This is where we part ways," he said. "Black Hawk is just a few hours' ride from here. The deputies will see you safely home." Margaret felt a pang of loss that surprised her with its intensity. In just a few days, this quiet, determined man had become important to her in ways she hadn't expected. "Will we see you again?" she asked. Ben's eyes met hers. For once, he didn't immediately look away. "I can't promise that." Samuel, who had been riding with one of the deputies, called out, "You have to come back, Mr. Blackett. You haven't taught me tracking yet." A brief smile touched Ben's lips. "Maybe someday, son." Margaret moved her horse closer to his. "Be careful," she said softly. "Don't let vengeance blind you to what matters." Ben nodded once, then turned his horse toward the mountains. Margaret watched him ride away, a solitary figure against the vast landscape, until he disappeared from view. The sight of Black Hawk brought both relief and anxiety. The familiar buildings and streets represented safety, but also the uncertainty of what awaited them at their home. Would Harper's men be watching? Was the map still where Samuel remembered it? Sheriff Mills met them at the edge of town, his weathered face showing rare emotion when he saw Samuel safe beside Margaret. "Mrs. Collins, thank the Lord," he said. "When I got the telegram saying you'd found the boy, I could hardly believe it." "Mr. Blackett deserves the credit," Margaret replied. "He's the one who tracked the kidnappers and helped us escape." The sheriff's expression clouded. "Blackett's a dangerous man to associate with, Mrs. Collins. He's been obsessed with Harper for years." "Some say he's not much better than the outlaws he hunts," Margaret bristled. "He risked his life for my son. I won't hear him spoken of that way." Sheriff Mills backed down. "Well, regardless, I'm glad you're both safe. I've had deputies watching your place." "It appears undisturbed since the kidnapping." With the deputies from Silverton and Black Hawk's lawmen forming a protective escort, Margaret and Samuel returned to their small home. The door had been repaired. She noticed the sheriff's doing, no doubt. Inside, everything was as they had left it, the signs of struggle still evident in overturned furniture and scattered belongings. Samuel immediately went to his father's side of the room, where a simple bookshelf stood against the wall. "Here, Mama," he said, pulling down a worn Bible with a cracked leather cover. "Pa's special book." Margaret took it reverently. James's grandfather's name was inscribed on the inside cover, along with dates of births, deaths, and marriages spanning 3 generations. She carefully turned the pages, looking for anything unusual. Near the center, where the Old Testament met the New, she found it a folded piece of parchment tucked into the binding. With trembling fingers, she extracted it and unfolded it on the table. The map was crudely drawn but detailed, showing landmarks Margaret recognized from the mountains west of Black Hawk. X marks and notations indicated what must be the location of the hidden gold. "Is that what the bad men wanted?" Samuel asked, peering at the map. "Yes," Margaret answered, troubled by the implications. "But it's not rightly ours, Samuel. This gold was stolen." Sheriff Mills, who had entered behind them, studied the map over her shoulder. "Army payroll gold by the looks of these markings." "There was a robbery during the war, a wagon train ambushed, 6 soldiers killed. The gold was never recovered." "What should I do with it?" Margaret asked. "Turn it over to the proper authorities," the sheriff said promptly. "There's likely still a reward for information leading to its recovery. Not as much as the gold itself, mind you, but enough to set you and the boy up comfortably." Margaret nodded. That seemed the right course, the honest one. James would have wanted that, she thought, despite his secrecy about the map. "I'll take it to Denver myself," Sheriff Mills offered. "Safer that way. Harper's still out there, and he's not one to give up easily." After the sheriff left with the map, Margaret set about restoring order to their home. Samuel helped as best he could, and by nightfall, most traces of the invasion had been erased. As she tucked Samuel into bed, his eyes were already drooping with exhaustion. "Mama," he murmured. "Do you think Mr. Blackett will catch the bad man?" Margaret smoothed his hair. "I think if anyone can, it's him." "I wish he could stay with us," Samuel said, his voice trailing off as sleep claimed him. "He could be my new pa." Margaret sat beside her sleeping son, his innocent words echoing in her mind. In the short time they'd known Ben Blackett, he had shown more courage and compassion than most men she'd encountered since James's death. And there had been moments, brief glances, the gentle way he spoke to Samuel, when she'd glimpsed the man beneath the hardened exterior. A man who could, perhaps, learn to love again. As could she. 2 weeks passed. Life in Black Hawk gradually returned to normal. Margaret resumed her laundry business, and Samuel went back to school, though he now carried James's revolver with him on the short walk each way, precaution Margaret insisted on, until Harper was captured. News came that the Army gold had been recovered based on the map's directions. As promised, the government issued a reward enough for Margaret to purchase a small dress shop she'd long admired in town. The previous owner was retiring to Denver, and the opportunity seemed heaven-sent. Yet despite these positive developments, Margaret found herself watching the road leading into town, hoping for a glimpse of a tall figure on horseback. Samuel, too, would often ask when Mr. Blackett might return. One evening, as Margaret was closing up the shop after her first day as owner, Sheriff Mills arrived with a telegram in hand. "This just came for you from the Territorial Marshal's office," he said, holding out the paper. Margaret read it with growing amazement. "Lias Harper captured. Stop Benjamin Blackett instrumental in apprehension. Stop Harper gang disbanded. Stop Blackett injured but recovering in Denver. Stop requests you be informed. Stop." "He did it," Margaret whispered. "He actually did it." Sheriff Mills nodded grudgingly. "Seems he did. Rumor has it he tracked Harper to a hideout near the Wyoming border. There was quite a fight from what I hear." "But he's injured," Margaret said, concern flooding her. "How badly?" "Telegram doesn't say." The sheriff studied her face. "You're not thinking of going to Denver, are you?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "That's exactly what I'm thinking, Sheriff." 2 days later, Margaret and Samuel stood outside the Territorial Hospital in Denver. She had left the shop in the capable hands of Mrs. Donna Van, a widow with experience in dressmaking, and taken the first available stage to the city. "Is Mr. Blackett in there?" Samuel asked, looking up at the imposing brick building. "Yes," Margaret replied, straightening his collar nervously. "Now remember, he might be quite ill, so we mustn't tire him." Inside, they were directed to a ward on the 2nd floor. The nurse led them to a bed near the window, where Ben lay with his eyes closed. His left arm was bandaged, and a healing cut ran along his jawline. He looked paler than Margaret remembered, but peaceful in sleep. "He's been asking about you," the nurse whispered before departing. First words when he woke up were asking if word had been sent to Black Hawk. Margaret approached the bed quietly, Samuel at her side. She hesitated, not wanting to disturb Ben's rest, but his eyes opened as if he sensed their presence. For a moment, he simply stared at them as if not quite believing his eyes. Then he smiled, a real smile that transformed his face. "You came," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Samuel rushed forward. "Mr. Blackett, did you catch all the bad men?" Ben's good hand ruffled the boy's hair. "Every last one, Samuel." Margaret moved closer, taking in the extent of his injuries. "The telegram said you were instrumental in Harper's capture. What it didn't say was how close you came to dying in the process." "It wasn't as bad as it looks," Ben said, though the shadows under his eyes suggested otherwise. "Liar," Margaret replied softly. "The nurse told us you've been here for nearly 2 weeks." Ben's eyes never left her face. "Why did you come, Margaret?" She sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly uncertain. "To thank you, to see that you were all right." She paused, gathering courage. "To ask what you plan to do now that your hunt is over." A shadow crossed Ben's face. "I haven't thought that far ahead. For 5 years, catching Harper was all that mattered. And now," Margaret pressed gently. Ben looked at Samuel, who was examining the marshal's badge someone had left on the bedside table. "Now I'm not sure what's left for me." Margaret took his hand. "There's plenty left if you want it. A new beginning, a chance to live for something besides vengeance." "I'm not sure I remember how," Ben admitted quietly. "I could help you," Margaret offered, "if you wanted to try." Something flickered in Ben's eyes, hope perhaps, or the beginning of it. "It wouldn't be easy. There are things in my past." "We all have pasts," Margaret interrupted. "What matters is the future we choose." Samuel turned from his exploration of the room. "Are you coming back to Black Hawk with us, Mr. Blackett? Mama has a shop now, and our house has an extra room since Mr. Peterson built on the addition before we left." Ben looked from the boy to Margaret, a question in his eyes. "You'd be welcome," Margaret said simply, "for as long as you want to stay." 2 months later, Margaret stood in the doorway of her shop, watching as Ben and Samuel returned from a fishing expedition to the creek outside town. They made an odd pair, the tall, still somewhat solemn man, and the chattering boy carrying a string of trout, but the sight of them together warmed her heart. Ben had been true to his word, returning to Black Hawk once the doctor cleared him to travel. He'd taken a room at the boarding house initially, helping out at the livery stable while he regained his strength. But he spent most evenings at Margaret and Samuel's home, slowly becoming part of their daily lives. The change in him was gradual but unmistakable. The hard edges softened. He smiled more easily. When nightmares of his past came, as they sometimes did, he no longer faced them alone. He caught sight of Margaret watching and raised his hand in greeting, his face brightening. Samuel ran ahead, eager to show off their catch. "Look, Mama. Mr. Ben showed me how to use a fly lure, and I caught the biggest one all by myself." Margaret admired the fish appropriately, then sent Samuel to clean them for supper. Ben approached more slowly, hat in hand. "Successful day?" she asked, smiling up at him. "Very. That boy's a natural." Pride colored Ben's voice. "How was business?" "Steady. Mrs. Wilson ordered a new Sunday dress, and the Henderson twins need outfits for their trip to Denver." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Ben cleared his throat. "I've been thinking, Margaret." Something in his tone made her heart quicken. "Yes, the marshal offered me a job, deputy for the territory based out of Denver." Margaret's smile faded. "Oh, I see." "I turned it down," Ben continued, watching her face carefully. "Told him I was needed here." Hope fluttered in Margaret's chest. "Are you needed here, I mean?" Ben stepped closer. "That depends on whether a certain shopkeeper and her son might have room in their lives for a man who's just learning how to live again." "I think they might," Margaret whispered. "In fact, I'm certain of it." Ben's hand came up to cup her cheek. "I'm not the same man who rode into Black Hawk chasing vengeance, Margaret. That man wouldn't have known what to do with happiness if it was handed to him on a silver platter." "And now," Margaret asked, leaning into his touch. "Now I know what matters," Ben said, "and I don't intend to let it go." When he kissed her, there on the boardwalk in front of her shop for all of Black Hawk to see, Margaret felt as if she'd finally come home after a long journey. And when Samuel came running back, laughing at the sight of them, Ben simply extended an arm to include the boy in their embrace. 1 year later, Margaret stood before the mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the lace collar of her new dress, pale blue silk, made by her own hands for this special day. From the window, she could hear the sounds of guests arriving at the church down the street. A knock at the door was followed by Samuel's voice. "Mama, Ben says it's almost time." Margaret opened the door to find her son looking uncommonly tidy in his new suit, hair slicked down with water. At 10 years old, he was growing tall. Soon he'd be as lanky as the man who was about to become his stepfather. "How handsome you look," Margaret said, straightening his tie. "Is Ben nervous?" Samuel grinned. "He says his hands haven't shaken this much since he faced down the Harper gang." Margaret laughed. "Tell him that's perfectly normal for a groom on his wedding day." As Samuel dashed off to relay the message, Margaret took a final look around the bedroom she'd shared with memories of James for so long. Tomorrow, she would move into the new house Ben had built on the edge of town, a fresh start for all of them. James would approve, she thought. He had always wanted her to be happy, to provide a good life for Samuel. And Ben's steady, honorable Ben had brought both back into their lives when she least expected it. At the church, Ben waited at the altar, looking both solemn and joyful in his new suit. When Margaret walked down the aisle on Sheriff Mills's arm with Samuel proudly bearing the rings, Ben's face lit up with a smile that told her everything she needed to know about their future together. "I never thought I'd have this again," he whispered as she reached him. "A family, a home, love." "Neither did I," Margaret replied, taking his hands in hers. "But here we are, Ben agreed, "and here we'll stay." As they spoke their vows before the assembled townspeople of Black Hawk, Margaret felt the last pieces of her heart healing. The past, with all its pain and loss, would always be part of them. But the future stretched before them now, bright with promise and possibility. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Ben kissed her with Samuel beaming beside them, Margaret knew that some journeys, even the most difficult ones, led exactly where they were meant to go. 5 years later, Margaret sat on the porch of their home, watching Ben teach their 3-year-old daughter Emily how to ride her first pony. Samuel, now 15 and nearly as tall as his stepfather, stood nearby, ready to assist if needed. The sound of Emily's delighted laughter carried on the summer breeze as the gentle pony took a few careful steps with Ben's hand firmly on the bridle. The little girl, a perfect blend of Margaret's features and Ben's blue eyes, was fearless, just like her father. "Look, Mama," she called. "I'm riding." "I see you, darling," Margaret called back, smiling at the picture they made the man she loved, the son of her heart, and the daughter who had completed their family. Black Hawk had grown over the years, as had Margaret's dress shop, now the finest in the county. Ben had eventually accepted a position as town marshal, his reputation as the man who brought down the Harper gang giving him instant authority. But it was his fairness and integrity that had earned him the respect of the townspeople. Their life together wasn't perfect, no life ever was. There were still nights when Ben woke from nightmares of fire and loss, when Margaret held him until the ghosts retreated. There were still days when Samuel, caught between childhood and manhood, tested boundaries and asked difficult questions about the father he barely remembered. But these moments were part of the tapestry of their shared life, threads of shadow that only made the bright patches more vivid by contrast. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across their property. Ben lifted Emily from the pony and set her on his shoulders. Samuel took charge of the pony, leading it back to the small stable as Ben climbed the porch steps to join Margaret. "She's a natural," he said, setting their daughter down to run after Samuel. "Just like her mother," Margaret laughed. "I think you're confusing me with someone else." "I was terrified of horses until I had to ride one to save Samuel." Ben sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "That's what I mean. Natural courage when it counts." They watched their children together, content in the peaceful moment. So much had changed since that desperate day when a tall stranger had promised to bring back her son or die trying. A promise kept, a life saved, a future rewritten. "You ever think about it?" Margaret asked softly. "What might have happened if you hadn't been in the sheriff's office that day?" Ben's fingers tightened around hers. "Every day. I rode into Black Hawk that day with nothing but vengeance in my heart. I never expected to ride out with a reason to live again." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder. "I'm glad you did." "So am I," Ben said, pressing a kiss to her hair. "So am I." As twilight deepened around them and Samuel and Emily's laughter echoed from the stable, Margaret closed her eyes in gratitude. For second chances, for promises kept, for love found in the aftermath of loss. And for the cowboy who had kept his word, bringing back not just her son, but hope itself, all those years ago.